Hi, and welcome back to CouchLit. My name is Sarah Squirk.
I'm Maria Sasso.
And I'm Peter Forrest.
And welcome back to my living room.
So cozy in here.
This is episode 3. Or 4.
No, it's episode 4.
For the last of our installment.
That's the last.
We hope you enjoyed.
It's me today. It's my little episode, I guess.
Your little spiel.
Yeah. So, I'm going to be leading us in a discussion, mostly for me, something that I was really interested in, especially on my second read, because I read Oranges, and I read Ordinary Girls back, obviously, when we were talking about them earlier, but I did another recent read, and I picked up on something that I don't think I really recognized, or I guess I maybe didn't think about it enough in my original, because I was just trying to get all the plot points of both stories, because
There's a lot going on
they're
in both of them.
very dense.
There's a lot going on.
But very good reads.
Yes, of course.
And so something that I was really interested in were the concepts of transgression and forgiveness, because I think they're so vital to both stories, especially in terms of familial relationships. Jeanette with her mother especially, and the way that they kind of have their turbulent journey throughout her childhood and her young adulthood, and when she comes back at the end. And then Jakira with, obviously all the members of her family, with her mother, with her maternal grandmother, with her father, with her brother, with her sister, and then with various men in her life as she goes throughout her adulthood. I think it's so important, especially in terms of looking at relationships through a lens of maybe the abuse that was suffered by both protagonists. So with Jeanette, with her mother's abuse and neglect, and with Jakira's, especially with her mother's relationship, because that's something that is it's so like she's surrounded by it in her childhood.
Right.
Like her mother's instability and the volatility of their relationship is something that impacts her throughout her life, but she still carries a love for her mother, especially towards the end, when she talks about, her successes, and she says, like, even though her whole family was at her graduation from college at the end, she says, I was struck with such a need, I was struck with such an urge for my mother to be there to see this.
Yeah.
And the way that she sees herself as she grows into adult, and the way that she sees her mother when she's an adult, when she sees her when she's going back for her maternal grandmother Mercy's death, her funeral.
Yeah.
The way that she internalized this view of her mother when she was young, and the way that she reconciles that with the way that she actually is now. Basically, just throughout the novel, Jakira goes through these stages of worshiping her dad, and then resenting him for not fighting harder to keep her and her sister Elena from her mother, and because her mother is she is plagued by mental health issues, especially when they're young, and she gets that at such a young age, because she's one of the first mentions of her mental illness, occurring when they're in Miami Beach after they've moved. She talks about how she was 11, and it's just like, you're hit with such, it's so heartbreaking, because
she's so young.
And her sister's even younger, and it's just it's just, I don't know.
I think when you were talking about that, it got me, thinking about, just, coming of age. I mean, that's obviously the discussion that we've been having, but with these familial relations of, some of the research Sarah did of, who people are coming out to.
Yeah.
And how very little of it was family. And that could be, for a myriad of reasons, whether, it be religion, like in Winterson's case, or, Jakira's fate. Jakira, it just wasn't coming up in daily questions. There was just so much going on with that family that it just wasn't even available. So, and thinking about their age also puts that into perspective of, being this young, realizing sexual feelings, not having a single person to tell them to, because you have more important things, as almost as if, you are especially, talking about Jeanette, her mom, so domineering, whatever she's doing is unimportant, compared to what her mother's duties to the church, so.
Well, especially with that, when you were just saying about the sexuality, especially with those sexual feelings, Jakira is so numb to it at a certain point, because as early as when she was like a very young child back before she moved to Miami Beach, that she was dealing with instances of sexual harassment, sexual violence, like that man exposed himself to her right in her front yard when she was a child, and
she never told her dad either.
Yeah, because she was so ashamed, and I think that's something that was built into her interiority, and I think that leads to a lot of isolation for her as an adult as she grows up, because even though she's seeking out these relationships, she doesn't feel connected to anyone. But something that I picked out when we were talking about this whole hero worship versus the resentment of her father is this little quote that I had from Ordinary Girls, and it says, "On the walk back, I gave her the silent treatment. Since we were going home, it was finally okay to hate her for what she'd done and for what she was. It seemed easier than hating my father for never standing up for us, or myself for letting her take us, or God for letting her be crazy." And it's like she struggles so much with these feelings of these feelings of hatred to both of her parents. One, her mother, for being so she wasn't able to be physically present for her, and she wasn't able to have the kind of presence of mind to look out for her and her sister, and her father for not sticking up for them, for not being more concretely there in their lives either. And that's something that comes up repeatedly in the novel, because he is so conflict averse, whereas her mother is so the opposite. She's the opposite end of the spectrum. She's always trying to get into conflicts, even as early as when she was a child, and there would be problems with maybe the dad was cheating, and she would be threatening to fight the other woman, or she'd be threatening the other woman with a knife.
It was always physical,
I think that's even another badge on the idea of the area of coming of age, because this comes from, I was listening to a basketball podcast
here we go.
at work the other day, but they weren't talking about they got rid of they stopped talking about basketball for a while, and one of the guys in there was talking about how you recognize that there are good and bad people, in and around the world, but he was saying how when you look into some people's lives and some of the issues that they've had, you're like, oh, now I know why you act the way what I would deem a bad person. I realize what you have. Now she said, as she was younger, she was like, when I was younger, it was easier to yell, at or to be mad at my dad, than it was my mom, and that's not a first realization, but in the retelling of it, in her rewriting of the story, of Jakira's rewriting of this in the story, it brings up those questions of wow, even at this young age, that shows how mature she was. I mean, a lot of things she did in the book were well above her age.
Yeah, of course.
But it shows that just mature way of thinking of okay, my mom's been through a lot, and she's addicted to drugs, and she has these mental disorders that, I do blame her, and I hate her for a lot of this, but right now it feels like I'm mad at my dad, who has, more of this kind of control. So yeah, I just thought that's another notch to coming of age, being able to, even like I said, first podcast, because they're at these transition coming of age novels are set at these transformative moments. You get to hear the mentality of the person before that moment and after that moment. So this is more of an after that moment. After she gets mad at her mom all the time. They're living in that really bad house. She has all these men over, and is just filled with this anger. And then she just has a couple of these experiences back to back where it's I still don't like how my mom's doing this, but there's more to it. You know what I mean? And more experiences. But Dad opened her eyes to that too.
I think that most of what you said I agree with, but the whole thing with her mom, the anger is misplaced for her, I think, in the sense that it is easier for her to be mad at her mom instead of easier for her to be mad at her dad, because in my opinion, I just think that since her mom is the one that's more consistently putting them in danger, though she might not have a lot of time to reflect on it, she does spend a lot of the book thinking about her anger towards her mom, and I think it's mostly because even though her dad is the one that, like, could be stepping in and saying, hey, these are my kids too, like, I will keep them, and you can get help, you can get treatment, whatever. I think it's easier for her to be like, when she has a free moment, to be like, if my mother were normal, then I would have a normal life. My father's non-confrontational abilities or whatever wouldn't be a problem, because my mom would just be the mom that I want, the ideal mom that I'm thinking of, you know?
No, I see that.
And then that kind of reminds me of another passage that I had, and this is shortly after she and her sister are taken by her mother, with little to no fight from her father, and they're returned, like, the mom brings them back, and she says, when Poppy came back inside our apartment, he didn't wrap his arms around us, or pick us up, or twirl us in the middle of the living room like I imagined he would. He just went to the bathroom to get ready for work. I wanted to shake and shake him. Did he know how scared we'd been? How many times had Mommy threatened to take us away, to keep us from him? Why hadn't he tried to find us? I knew Poppy. He avoided conflict. Even when they were still married, no matter how many times I'd shown him the bruises from one of Mommy's beatings, he never said a word to her. I realized then that if my mother wanted to take me and Elena, she could have us, and there was nothing my father would do about it. Which I think is so interesting to think about. She's such a young girl, and she's already having to reconcile with the fact that, like, she feels so helpless in the situation, and she recognizes that her father is essentially helpless in the situation because he's never going to do anything to change their circumstances. And I think that ties directly back to this idea of transgression and forgiveness, because no matter how many times the mom takes them and brings them back, she still has to live with her dad. She still has to live with the fact that this is her reality for the foreseeable future, that she will continue to be taken at her mother's whim. And whether she wants to put up with them, and she'll have to look out for herself and for Elena, her sister. And I think that's so interesting to kind of grapple with, because she's going through these developmental stages in her life. And it's just so strange, because she has to deal with her parents' whole dynamic, and she also has to deal with, like, trying to keep herself safe.
I think, and I liked what you said about how she's going through all of these, like, these developmental stages, and, you know, you said she was powerless, you know, she is so powerless in the situation, but it's also, like, she's powerless over, you know, what her dad does and everything like that, but she is also just, like, her voice is so quiet, and not literally, but it just feels like it's not existent. You're shouting into the void when, like, she's experiencing some of the most in the story, and I think that's, you know, just because of the ages of I mean, we've discussed before about just, like, how much, you know, coming of age can happen at any time, and how it comes in a bunch of literary forms, or a bunch of different forms, and at different ages. These young age coming of age, you know, around these times where it's just, like, so powerless, and yet you have all of these emotions, and there's so much difference between power and faith, and trust, you know, that just, it's out of balance, and there's no power.
And I think something that you just touched on with faith, it kind of leads me into my Jeanette segment, because she obviously, if there's a story to talk about faith, it's oranges. She is knee deep in religion. So I think that's something that is so important to the themes of transgression and forgiveness in her story, is obviously the central relationship between her and her mother. But more broadly, it's the relationship with her and religion, because she feels, like we mentioned, she talked about the quote with God not being the betrayer. Like, you think about, like, the only thing that she had other than her mother was God. And that was her closest relationship in her life. So you have to think about the things that she went through when she realized that she was a lesbian, and what that meant for her religious life, and what that meant for the way that she interacted with spirituality, and how lonely she felt when she was isolated from religion as a result of her leaving the church to be herself, and to be a lesbian, just fully herself and authentically. I think that's so interesting to talk about, how she didn't see God as the betrayer, but she saw the people in her church that were so vehemently against her sexuality, how she saw them turn on her, and how eventually she went back to that town, and when she was working for the funeral home, she had to interact with all of them, and the way that she deals with that is so interesting because they are so angry that she's there, even after all these years have passed. Even though she's still quite young when this is happening, because obviously she was kicked out at 16.
Yeah.
She's dealing with this, and she kind of has a little sarcastic edge to her, and that just makes them even more mad.
Right. Like, she was able to kind of realize where she stood, and she felt very comfortable in herself at that point, and they were scared of her.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't understand her.
Yeah, that power switch, like, when she finally, snapped back. I mean, like, not in a big way because she was kicked out before she got the chance to, but, she was even like, I think she quoted back with scripture, I think, at one point. She said, like, all things that you love are pure, and all things that are pure are loved.
You're the problem, not us.
Yeah,
when she was with Melanie.
I just think there are so many points throughout Jeanette's story where she doesn't have a say in what happens. Like, I'm thinking of how when she was a kid and she literally had hearing loss, like she was deaf,
literally,
and everyone around her was like, "You're fine, like you're not deaf," like, and she didn't she didn't realize that she was deaf because the people around her were just like, "You're fine," or like they didn't take it seriously, or just her being in the church and her relationships with her mom, and how her mom so quickly just put her down in so many instances. Like, I'm also remembering when she had to get a new coat. Yes. And she didn't want that, like, pink one, I think it was, because it made her look bad, or she just didn't like it. And her mom was like, too bad you're getting it. And how awful that was for her, how it made her feel so bad. And there were just so many instances throughout the story where she just has those moments where her voice isn't prioritized.
Well, it's so interesting that you bring up the coat moment, because it's like integral to her whole understanding of her mother and her mother's view of the world around them. Like, she is so much about appearances. Yeah. Because originally she wasn't going to buy her a certain coat or something like that. Yeah. And then somebody else stopped them on the street and they were like, "Oh, this is kind of a ratty coat." Yeah. And the other one was like, she was like, "Oh, well, I'm just keeping this one. My mom said I'm just keeping it." And the mom's like, "We're going to get you a new coat right now." Yeah. But originally that was not the plan. Right. But it's so interesting to see how she changes with the scrutiny of her fellow parishioners on her, especially in terms of, I'm thinking, like, obviously, more importantly, when she's talking about how, okay, now we can't be female ministers, and she just immediately steps down from that position, like, even though that has literally been her whole life up to that point.
Her whole purpose,
like,
was being involved in the church. And they're like, "You can't do that, you're a woman." She's like, "Okay."
Yeah, like, I don't understand how that was not more of a stumbling block for her, but I think it has to do with her intense fear of being judged by the others. Yeah.
Fear and power, I think, is like a classic coming of age, and I think it's a spectrum of, like, it's either one or the other. It's very rarely in the middle in terms of power. Like, old classic, not coming of age, like Catcher in the Rye, kid alone in the city with not unlimited money, but any money he wants, he can do whatever he wants. He's got all the power in the world to figure himself out in New York City. And Perks being Wallflower, you have some moment when he is abused, where it's like, he's at the least powerful, and then he's with a bunch of seniors who have a car. You can drive around the city of Pittsburgh and do whatever you want. So there's this, like, dynamic of full powerlessness that we see in Jeanette's case. Right. And sometimes full reign of power.
How you can kind of see the arc with character development.
Yeah, in coming of age, especially.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting to consider when you talk about these transgressions, because all of the things that she's doing, all the things that Jeanette's mother is doing, is what she believes is in Jeanette's best interest. Oh, yeah. But it's not really in her best interest, because she sets up in the beginning, Jeanette says in the beginning, like, I was my mother's, like, flaming sword, basically. Yeah. I was my mother's tool to use in the fight against the devil, because she was her little foundling or whatever. Yeah. She was adopted. Obviously, her mom she didn't want to have a child biologically. It's not that she couldn't. Yeah. But she chose, because she fancied herself the next Virgin Mary, I suppose. But she's so vehement on, I love to say vehement these days, but she's so,
it's a fancy word.
She's so intent on using her child instead of thinking of herself as a mother, as a more, warm, fuzzy maternal feeling.
Right.
It's so interesting to think about how she considers her daughter and not really what her daughter wants, but rather what her daughter can do to serve her.
Right.
And to serve the greater purpose, as she puts it.
Right.
And stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that's just something I was thinking about when we were talking about that.
No, that's great. I love that.
But, I mean, if we go back to Ordinary Girls, I think that tracing the whole relationship with even if you talk about the more auxiliary characters, when you talk about her interactions with her maternal grandmother, Mercy, I think it's so interesting to think about the transgressions and forgiveness that how their relationship changes over time, because obviously when she's younger, the grandmother is so racist.
Oh yeah.
Like, she treats her like garbage.
Yeah, cuts off all over her
the haircut, she calls her
the N-word,
multiple times. Yeah, that's where she gets that kind of seed of self-doubt, that self-hatred, which is kind of counteracted by her abuela, who always kind of teaches them to love themselves and
love their blackness.
And kind of embrace themselves fully. But you can see how things have changed when she's older, because right before Mercy had died, she has that phone call with Jakira right at the end, and she talks about they talk about their lives, and she said that's the longest conversation that they've had that they've known each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting that they have that, like, right before she dies.
Right.
Because obviously she commits suicide, but Jakira has no idea that she's going to commit suicide.
Yeah.
She says that her grandmother had been committing suicide for 25 years because of all the times that she had threatened to be crushed by a truck or jump off a building or drink a whole bottle of medicine or take pills or whatever. Yeah. And I think it's such a turning point for them in their relationship, because it seems like they actually see each other, and she sees, even more externally, she sees, like, the webs of connection, because she sees how Mercy had taken care of her mom, even though they were both pretty, like, bad. They were both worse off for wear, but you can see how they did still care about each other, even though she says they cared about each other in a way that two addicts do. Yeah. But it's just, it's so interesting to see, like, even them having such a turbulent relationship too, these through lines of motherhood and what it means to be a daughter. Yeah. I think it's so fascinating to track, because they go through so much, but still they are there for each other in the ways that they can be. Right.
Yeah, and they go through all that, and they're still tertiary characters as well. Like, they're not even, I mean, they're there, and they're very important, obviously, but they're not, some of these main focuses throughout her life.
Right, and I think that just, to tie it all together, coming of age story is about those people that you meet throughout your life who, because, think about all the times that you have met a single person and they had some big impact, or the people that you knew in high school, and, like, how you don't even speak to them anymore, and they just still had such an effect on your life and have helped you become the person that you are today. And I think so many coming of age stories are about those main characters, but are also all about those tertiary characters and how they are all involved.
And I think that kind of ties in directly to one of my quotes from Jeanette's perspective. And she talks in the end, this is one of the last chapters of the book, she says, "I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever been anywhere. My mother was treating me like she always had. Has she noticed my absence? Did she even remember why I'd left? I have a theory that every time you make an important choice, the part of you left behind continues the other life you could have had," which kind of made me think of that with the whole tertiary characters thing. Like, there are so many instances in your life where you can go down a different path, and she sees it as this way, like, in another world, somebody is going down that different path. And I think that's so important to consider, like, the consequences and the ramifications of your actions and the way that impacts you as a person moving on.
And especially in a coming-of-age story, because typically these stories mean something in the way that they're impacting the character, and it's just showing and showcasing how with specific actions throughout these particular novels led to certain outcomes, and how those outcomes and stuff had led to these novels and these narratives. And
and even they're pointing out, like, you know, there's a lot of stories, you know, pull in a lot of different ideas, but like coming of age, from what I've had, I mean, because it's at those moments, and at those moments we get to a lot of existential thoughts, so coming of age novels are gonna eventually end on those, you know, existential you know, type of thoughts.
Well, I think it's so interesting to kind of deal with, like, all of the things that she deals with, Jeanette deals with in the novel, and then she's kind of returned to her home, and she's returned to kind of this mundane setting, like, her mother is doing her daily life broadcast or whatever.
Everything is essentially the same.
And she remarks on that, and, like, that's how it ends, like, calling out for she's doing, like, the CB radio, and it's so interesting to see, like, she knows that this is maybe a shaky truce with her mother, because she can see the way that it kind of cracks her facade.
Yeah.
But it's just so weird to think about, like, she's been through all of this traumatic stuff, but then at the end she's returned to this kind of, like, almost in her childhood, because she starts the novel. She starts the novel with her mother discussing their morning routine, and they're doing their daily devotionals, and then at the end she's doing pretty much the same thing, but all of this life has happened in between those two, bookended by these two, and her devotion to this religion, and to this religion that really didn't serve her for the most part from the mother's perspective. And it's just something that it's so strange to think about. You can give your life to something like that, and that can be for anything. That can be farther than religion. You can give your life to a person.
Right.
And it's like,
doesn't work out.
With these characters especially, you can give your life with living in these families. With Jakira, she lives in this family where most of them abuse each other.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, for the most part, with the exception of pretty much Elena. Elena really doesn't get it as much as Jakira does. Yeah. I mean, her brother smacks her over the head with a frying pan and partially deafens her in her one ear, and that's what leads to the stabbing.
Yep.
I mean, these things don't happen in the typical family.
Right.
It's just so interesting to see. But then at the end, they're all at her graduation.
Yeah.
You know, like, you have to deal with these whole, like, obviously you can't pick your family, but in a larger sense, it's like, you have to pick what part of your family you're returning to. You have to pick you have to pick what you're valuing. Yeah. And you have to kind of think, like, in these kind of situations where trauma is all you know, these people are the people that weathered it with you, even if sometimes they were the ones inflicting it on you.
Right.
And I think that's something to consider, because even though they went through all of this stuff, like the father being absent, or the brother being abusive, or the mother being abusive, she still wants them in her life. Right. And I think whether it be cultural or whether it be something that she was brought up in, I think it's something that she can't escape in a formational way. Yeah, yeah. Right. Not in a way that, like, oh, well, she can't escape it even if she tried. But I think it's something like, even though it's not a physical home, she's always returning to these places. Right. When we were talking about landscape, it's more of the mental landscape that she's in and stuff like that. But this reminded me of.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you're good. I'm good.
Guys, please.
No, I had nothing to say.
Okay. I was thinking about the father being absent, and one of the things that I was thinking of, they kind of parallel each other, are these two moments in the novel Ordinary Girls. And she says, I stared at my father hard in the face, how easily he had just given us away. I started crying too. There comes a time when we realize that our parents cannot protect us as much as we want them to or need them to. Mm-hmm. There comes a time when we realize that we must save ourselves. I picked up the bag and without taking my eyes off my father said, I will never forgive you. But this theme of forgiveness comes back again and again, because ultimately, for better or worse, she still values him so much, and she's still always seeking his approval, which, I mean, it's directly in the next, I mean, it's about maybe 20 pages off. She says, and this is after a little bit of her being in and out of juvie, or her recounting tales of her being picked up by the police, or her dealing with addiction, and her going to this Narcotics Anonymous or what have you. She says, "Choose life," he will say, "and my father, trying to make up for all those years of absence, trying to be a better man than he'd been his whole life, will shake his hand, will wrap his arm around me, will say, 'This is not the life I want for you,' and how my whole body will shake when he holds me. And he won't know it yet, but I will spend my whole adult life trying to make him proud of me." Like, even though she has so many conversations with her father and so many disputes with him about the way that she's being raised and about the way that he could have protected her more, like she mentions how they're kind of helpless in that situation. Yeah. She's still constantly measuring up to him. She's still trying to weigh all of her actions on what her father would want for her and the life that he wanted for her and stuff like that. And I think that's something that you can't get away from.
Right.
And I think that's something that's kind of a big deal in a lot of coming of age novels.
Yeah.
Where you're constantly, even if it's not your family members, it's somebody in your life.
It's one specific person
that you're trying
to reach.
Yeah. Yeah. And like no matter what, you're always kind of striving to make them proud, even if they don't know it, even if they're not in your life anymore.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I think that's it. So that's episode 4. So again, we talked about Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit and Ordinary Girls by Jakira Diaz. If you really liked how we talked about it, like, definitely I would read these.
They're great novels.
They're great, especially if you like coming of age, you know. They're really, really wonderful stories.
Really well written, and a lot of the stuff is just
tight. You can have conversations for hours about them.
They're as really we have shown.
So thank you guys so all for watching. Again, I'm Peter Forrest.
I'm Sarah Spurg.
I'm Maria Sasso.
And this was
CouchLit.
Thank you.